Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Today we take a look back at a project I built a few years ago that was quite popular with our viewers. It featured a shop-built custom fireplace mantle. All too often, homeowners live in houses with fireplace surrounds they really don't like, or they don't fit the decor of the room. Although there's no shortage of woodworking shops that can build you exactly what you want, custom fireplace mantles are expensive. Yet with only a few good tools, a good table saw, a router, a chop saw, perhaps a pneumatic nailer, and a biscuit joiner, a very nice custom mantle can be built in the home shop. This project gave me plenty of incentive to design and build just the right fireplace surround. What resulted is exactly what I wanted. And best of all, here in this Yankee Workshop, if you discount the cost of a little plywood, a few links of clear pine, and a few sticks of some stock molding, we'll consider the labor free, the project was a steal. So in a minute, we'll be right back to build a fireplace mantle right here in the new Yankee Workshop. Why is it that the shoemaker's children never have shoes and the carpenter's house is never finished? Is it because we're working on other people's projects? That's probably true. That's what's going on here in my formal living room. I have a nice fireplace, but no mantle. When I built the house, we had designed this wall with a mantle and some raised panels above it, but there were no details. Now, one source I went to was salvage yards. I looked around for antique mantles that might fit this fireplace, but I had a problem. This is a Rumford fireplace, and the opening is square. Most fireplaces have openings that are wider than they are tall. So I didn't get anywhere there. I decided to turn to some of my source books. And even though I knew I wouldn't find an exact mantle that would fit the job, I would find a family of details. Here's one that shows Colonial fireplaces from New England. Here's one that shows some molding details. I even went to some of my building magazines. There were a lot of good ideas. So I turned to the drafting board and drew up what I thought might be a nice mantle. Pilasters with flutes, lots of decorative moldings, and a good-sized mantelpiece. Now all I got to do is get the materials and get to work. I'm going to start building the mantle with this piece of 3/4-inch birch plywood. It'll be the base onto which I'll set all the moldings and decorative elements. It's also a good choice because it's more stable than solid wood, especially around a fireplace where you're going to have heat. And being that it's a painted piece, it gives me a good paintable surface. Now, if you'd like to build the mantle, a measured drawing with the materials list will be available, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. The first step is to make a rough cross-cut on this sheet of plywood, since I don't need the whole piece. So I've set up this straight-edge clamp, and I'm going to trim it with my small circular saw. But before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now I've just ripped a piece of plywood that's 20 inches wide. I am now going to cut this into two pieces 9.5 inches wide for the legs. Now I've just ripped a piece 15 7/8 inches wide for the header to connect the legs. The header piece is a little too wide to cut at the radial arm, so I'm going to use my homemade panel cutter. Here you see the header and one of the legs. And I have to join the two pieces together, and let me show you what the problem is. If I simply butt them together, this entire joint will show in the finished piece. However, if I offset it over, this part of the joint will be hidden behind the pilaster, and the only part that will show will be this small miter. Now the miter has to be perfect. We'll cut that at the table saw. To guide the leg, I'm going to use my miter gauge. And I've brought the saw blade up higher out of the table to minimize the overcut on the back side of the piece. I'm very carefully going to guide it in and stop just short of the intersection of the two lines. You'll notice that I let the blade stop before I pulled the piece back. Now it's necessary to move the fence to the other side of the saw blade to cut the opposite leg. The objective is that I don't want the waste material to get wedged between the fence and the saw blade. And that takes care of the miter cut on the header. Okay, that's good. Now we'll glue them and fasten it with some screws. To join the pieces together, you're going to see me use a method that I haven't used for some time, pocket screws. What I need to do is have a slot and a pilot hole for the screw, and this panhead screw will pull the joint tightly together. It's amazing how strong it actually is. Of course, the slot is on the back side of the work, so you never see it. To make it, I'm going to use this machine. It has a lever on the top, it has a forward motion and a back motion. Let me show you what each does. The forward motion brings up a router and a straight cutting bit to make the tapered slot. The pull motion brings out a drill bit, which makes the pilot hole in the edge of the work. Now, this is a production machine, and you can make a lot of joints very quickly. You can imagine how quickly you could make face frames for cabinets with a machine like this. Now a bead of glue on the joint, and we'll assemble it with a few screws. It's the head of the screw that does the work. That's not going anywhere. Now that's incredibly strong and tight. I really like that method. One of the classic details of the fireplace mantle is a fluted pilaster. I want to make flutes that run from this point to this point. There'll be 5 across here, 1/2 inch wide, 1/4 inch deep. We'll make those at the router table. I've just run a sample of the first flute, which will be right in the center. I'm using a 1/2 inch round nose bit that's 1/4 inch above the table. I've also transferred lines back to the fence that show the leading and trailing edges of the bit. With the layout lines on the back side of each pilaster, I'll drop it over the bit at the trailing line first, slide it through, stop at the leading edge, remove the piece. With the fence now 7/8 inch closer to the bit, I could make 2 more flutes. By once again moving the fence 7/8 inch closer to the cutter, I can make the final 2 flutes. Here on the back of each pilaster, I'm adding some 1/4 inch thick strips, and this will give the pilaster a thicker look. Now the pilasters are ready to be glued and nailed to the leg backs. I'm just going to use a 1.5 inch brad. Here I've dry fitted some pieces to wrap the bottom of each pilaster. The corners are mitered. And here's a tip. If you have a piece of pine that's curled, as this one was, if you make a kerf cut down the center, you can flatten it to make the miters fit better. Now let me show you how I cut these pieces. Here's another piece of pine for the base of the other pilaster. And if you look at it, you can see there's a bit of a cup. It's not much, but it makes it difficult to make the miters. So for the first step, I'll make 1 pass, cutting a little more than halfway through, right down the center. Now you can see that just by pushing down on it with a little bit of effort, it flattens the board right out. With the saw blade tipped to 45 degrees, I'll miter each end of this piece. With the saw blade tipped up to 90 degrees, each end will yield a side piece. With 1 miter cut on the front piece, I can set it in place and get an accurate mark for the length. Now first, I'm just going to nail on the front piece. No glue. The only place we'll have glue on these pieces are along the miter joint. Okay. Just squeeze this into place. Attach it with a couple more brads. Good morning. I'm getting started today by wrapping the top of each pilaster, except this time I'm using pieces of plywood which have the edges mitered. I'm using the plywood because it's a more stable material and because none of these edges are actually going to show. So I guess it's a good choice. Well, now it's really starting to look good as I begin to add the decorative moldings. On top of the blocks at the base of each pilaster, I'm installing a base molding. Now, this is a standard profile that I pick up at my lumber yard. Normally, it's used on top of baseboards. I start with a piece about a foot long, set it on the side of the pilaster, and mark the short point of the miter. Now I also take the time to bring my pencil mark onto the top of the molding, set it in the miter box, swing it over to 45 degrees, align it with my laser line, and trim it off. Okay, now I swing the miter box to 45 degrees on the other side of 0, slide the laser to the other side of the blade, and cut the opposite piece. The next step is to size the front piece. So I need one of the end pieces, and I've already mitered one end of the front piece. Set it in place, mark the miter point, back to the miter box. All right, I'll check the fit, and that's good. So now I can nail on the side pieces with a 1 1/4 inch brad. And then apply a little bit of glue to the miters, finish up the front piece. The next piece of decorative molding is a band that goes around the pilaster below the built-out section at the top, and it aligns with the fireplace opening. It's a scotia molding, another standard molding that you can pick up at the home center. And I've cut the pieces at the miter box just as I did with the lower base molding. And I'm going to nail the front piece in place first. Now, because this molding is so tiny, the side pieces are going to be installed with glue only, because I think even the smallest gauge brad would probably split the piece. That's good. Now, there's another piece that goes on top of the scotia. We'll make that at the router station. To make the next piece, I've installed a router bit in my table similar to this one. You can't see it because the featherboard is in the way. It's a beading bit. This one is a 1/2 inch diameter. The one that I've installed in the table is a 3/8 inch diameter. I'm only using this rounded portion of the bit. Give me a piece that looks like this. With the pieces mitered, you can see how this dresses up that scotia molding. And once again, because these side pieces are so small, just glue will secure them in place. Next, I want to dress up the bottom of the built-out pilaster at the top and the header piece. There'll be 2 moldings. First, a 5/8 inch thick nosing that I'll make at the router table. And then I'm taking a standard band molding from which I'm removing this top portion to yield a 1 1/2 inch piece. First, the nosing will go on, then the band will sit right below it. And what that does is equalizes the reel of the header and the leg. To make the nosing, I'm going to use a 3/8 inch radius bit. 2 passes will do the job. With all the pieces mitered in a dry fit, now I'm ready to install them. A little bit of glue along the back edge, and then I'll fasten it with some 1 9/16" brads. Well, now I can start to install the band. A little bit of glue. I'm going to start with this long centerpiece, and then work my way around each pilaster. Here I've flipped the mantle over, and I'm adding some 1/4" strips of plywood to give the mantle some thickness where it meets the plaster wall. I've just milled up a couple pieces of router table as decorative trim elements. I'm using the same 3/8" radius bit I had earlier, except with thicker stock I get a bit of a shoulder. This narrow piece is going to go along the outside edge of each leg, covering the end grain of the plywood and giving me a nice bead detail. I'm also milling some wider pieces with the same bead that'll go along the inside of the mantle, and those will actually butt up against the brick. I'm in no hurry to install these now, not until the mantle is set in place. This piece of 3/4" birch plywood is for the shelf of our mantle. And I'm just lining it up with a center mark, and I'll attach it with some 6-penny finish nails. The next piece is 1/2" thick pine that I'm setting to a line, and that's to give me a shadow line against which I can set this final piece of cornice molding, which will be next. This piece of molding that we're going to use here under the mantle shelf is sold at the home center as cornice molding. Now imagine if this was a solid piece of wood, it would come up like this being the ceiling, this being the wall where this little cove detail is. The reason they don't use solid material is that it's a waste of material, plus it wouldn't fit to irregular surfaces like plaster walls and ceilings. Here I've put a line for the bottom of the molding. I'm just going to drop it into place and attach it with some brads. Let me show you a tip about cutting crown or cornice molding here at the miter box. You need a nice straight edge clamped in the right position. Imagine that the table of the miter box is the ceiling and that the fence is the wall. Once you know the distance that the molding will actually cover the ceiling, clamp a nice straight piece of lumber across the miter box. Again, imagine if this was a solid piece of molding. This would be the corner of where the wall would meet the ceiling. The molding always goes in the miter box upside down. The cut that I just made was across the face of the molding. It's for this inside corner. Now I could have done the same thing to the other piece, the first piece that was installed, but the problem with wide moldings is that they shrink and you'll get a big gap there later. The best way to treat inside corners is to cope them. Once the cut is made across the face, the next thing I like to do is take a pencil and just run it at the intersection of the profile and the cut. And that gives me a guideline so I can use a coping saw to remove this material. Now I like to cut these perpendicular cuts first and then cut the curved profiles to it. Okay, let's see how she fits. All right, well, after a couple touch-ups with the coping saw, I think we got the fit just the way I want it. Now I can mark it for length. Now I set the piece in the miter box, upside down, and I can make that outside miter cut. All right, let's check the fit on this piece. I've taken and mitered in the same fashion the piece that goes across the front of the pilaster, and those are fitting nice. So now I can mark this piece for length. Okay, now that's about as far as I can go with this cornice molding until I actually get to the installation. But there's one more piece I want to do in the shop, a little band on the front edge of the shelf. There's going to be a decorative edge on the front of the piece, so I'm using my 1/4-inch radius beading bit. I want to run a bead at the top edge and at the bottom edge. So I'll run the piece through on one side, flip it over, run the other side. A little bit of glue. And I've mitered the end of the piece so it'll wrap around the shelf. I hold it flush at the top and attach it with some more brads. All right, well, that's about all I can do here in the shop. The rest of it I'll have to do in the field, but maybe I should give it a coat of primer first. I think it looks pretty good. Well, what do you think? With a coat of primer on it, it's really starting to look good. Now, the first thing I did when I got it here to the house was to scribe the base of the pilasters to fit the floor. Even in a new house, everything is not perfectly flat or level. Now, you might recall that when we were in the shop, I made these decorative pieces which would cover the edge grain of the plywood. I was able to put these small pieces on right away because the wall was nice and straight and it didn't need to be scribed. However, the pieces that trim the inside of the opening do have to be scribed because of the brick. What I did is I just slipped the piece in, make sure that it's parallel with the pilaster, and then take a pair of dividers, set it to the distance that it needs to be pushed in, and scribe the brick. Now with it scribed, I just remove it and go to work with my block plane and a rasp until I'm right to the line. The objective here is to leave just a little bit of the line. Just split it. All right, let's check the fit. I'd say that's pretty good. Now a couple brads will hold it in place. All right. Well, that just about takes care of the woodworking. Well, I finally finished one of the projects around my house. Now there's only 9,463 to go. But there's always next time right here on the New Yankee Workshop.